how do we represent nighttime in our images? It can actually be pretty simple when you think about how day for night is used to create a nighttime feeling during the day. And shooting day for night is actually very straightforward in terms of the light itself, because the moon and the sun exhibit practically the same quality of light. A sunlit location on a clear day and a moonlit location on a clear night might seem quite different to our own eyes, but with contrast, shadows and colour balance adjusted to match more closely, we can see that they're actually very similar. The sun is much bigger than the moon, but because of their distances from us on Earth, they appear as similarly sized light sources. And because of these apparent similar sizes, both the sun and the moon produce hard, direct light, which is why they look nearly identical. But as the sun is brighter, we have the side effect of blue sky, which is the Earth's atmosphere scattering blue and violet rays from the sun's white light. This means, as well as sunlight, the atmosphere acts as a secondary cooler light source, and along with bounce light from the sun, fills in shadows during the day. The moon does this too, but to our eyes it's barely perceptible, and shadows can appear pitch black. Moonlight itself also appears much bluer than sunlight, and this is because our eyes switch to a different set of cells to perceive such a low level of light, becoming more sensitive to the blue end of the colour spectrum. So our own limited perception of moonlight is a very important thing to understand when shooting day for night, as we need to recreate this human understanding of how night looks with the tools we have to alter our images, with the most modern and accessible way being post-processing and colour grading. But we can't just shoot under sunlight and expect a few exposure and white balance adjustments to look right for every scenario. If we have the sun directly lighting our subject, we have a flat-looking scene regardless of the colour grade's intent. And although this is representative of how we may see moonlight from this angle, it doesn't necessarily translate well to screen. Changing the camera's perspective and using the sun as a backlight, however, we have an image that feels more like moonlight due to the amount of shadow in the scene. Darken down the daytime sky, and you can see how this forms a better replication of how our eyes might struggle to see in the dark, whilst utilising the sun/moon in the same way we might light a daylight scene with side or backlight on our subject. However, we can't see his face, and that leads us to how we lit the introduction to this episode. We shot in a wooded area, and since the sun is shining through gaps in the trees overhead, we're able to capture lots of contrast between light and shadow, perfect for converting sunlight to moonlight, with a drop in exposure and cooling down of the image. We shot this sequence quite erratically to reflect the panic of a possible chase through the moonlit woods, with our character stopping in a predetermined spot, his face hit by moonlight, which was really sunlight. For the final close-up of him turning around, we used a simple 4x4 silver reflector, positioned to reflect the sun which was backlighting him. In the same way this could be motivated as sunlight bouncing from the floor and back into the face, we can just as easily tell our audience that this is cooler moonlight bouncing from the floor and back into the face. If we're not happy with a sun slightly lower in the sky, we might choose to shoot with a slightly higher one, which can subconsciously affect the way we may imagine a full moon being high in the sky, leading to an image we might feel as more realistic to moonlight. Here, we actually used a Nanlite Alien 300C with no diffusion, aimed at our 4x4 silver reflector, since we didn't have any sun hitting the ground where we needed to reflect it. This allowed us again to motivate the light on the face as a bounce from the moonlight hitting the floor nearby. It's worth noting that not all nighttime shots need to be so blue. Depending on the style we're going for, we could bring some more colour back in. Contrast between light and dark is just as, if not more, important than colour. But what about shooting day for night in cloudy or overcast weather? We can approach this the same way as before, by treating our imagined moonlight just like daylight. And on a cloudy day, we might aim to use some negative fill to create some shape on the face. So we did this here with a 4x4 floppy flag. A cooling down of our white balance, a lowering of exposure, and finally bringing down the sky recreates a cloudy night. It can be trickier to control the large, even coverage of light from an overcast sky, so it's worth thinking about how bright or dark elements of your location are, and if you need to bring some down in post-production. As with hard light, it's important to have a lot of dark shadow to convey our eyes struggling to see in the darkness, yet retain visibility in the highlights. This can be a little tougher to achieve in overcast conditions, as we don't have such a large contrast to work with, which may lead to extreme underexposure to compensate. But overall, both night looks can be valid, depending on the mood you're trying to create. Another option when shooting day for night in cloudy conditions is to bring in a light. What initially might feel like late evening or blue hour can feel more like nighttime by simply introducing some light to our subject. We used the Forza 720B with its compatible Fresnel lens, focused in on our subject's face. The face being brighter than the sky is something we would only really see at night, with the other factors of a nighttime feeling in place. Lower exposure to represent diminished vision, and a cooler colour grade to represent the way our eyes adjust to this darkness. We direct the audience to the brightest part of the image, the face, in the same way our eyes would function when focusing on a subject at night. This creates a realistic representation of the elements of our vision at nighttime, but in a stylistic way, mixing the hard light of the moon with a softer background light. And even if the previous shot doesn't feel totally like nighttime initially, by placing it in a sequence with one or more shots that do, we create an overall feeling of nighttime in the scene as a whole. This same technique could be achieved with a softer light, but this would need a lot more power and a more expensive lighting fixture, and that may remove some of the budgetary reasons for shooting day for night to begin with. Analysing any of these shots on their own, without the context needed to establish the image in a bigger story, can lead to a sense of unrealism. But ultimately, any of the techniques or looks in this video can be used for day for night, especially if the surrounding scene or elements of the story come together in a convincing, immersive way. It'll still feel like night to your audience if everything is congruent. Episodes of Lighting for Cinema are extended and released early over on my Patreon, along with extra videos and access to the Discord server.